Previously on AP World History, Pope plays marriage counselor between Spain and Portugal. Also, he talked about the importance of stupid smart people and how most Europeans actually knew that the world was round, uh, but they thought it was actually far too vast, far too big to do anything crazy like, I don't know, cross the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. Unless you're Christopher Columbus, where you basically do the math wrong and you conclude the world is actually a lot smaller than it is, thereby making him the first modern European. We have to give credit where the credit's due, looking at you, Vikings. First modern European to discover the New World, at least from the perspective of Europeans. So today we're going to be looking at other colonization and exploration attempts, specifically by Spain, but also we'll bring in some other European powers as well. And the word I want you to kind of remember is conquistador. A lot of these overseas exploration attempts are led by conquistadors, which is a Spanish word that just means conqueror. But these aren't conquerors like Alexander the Great or Kublai Khan or Genghis Khan or any of these, warrior kings who managed to conquer a huge chunk of the surface of the earth. Most of these conquistadors were just like rando guys, because and this is kind of critical. The New World is already seen as a land of opportunity. Before the American dream, before we get the idea of people basically moving up the social hierarchy, owning a house in the suburbs with a garage and two cars and two kids, whatever. We have this idea that the New World is a place where people can climb up the social ladder. And there's a good reason for that, because to basically be somebody in the European social hierarchy meant that you owned land. Land in Europe was fairly scarce. There had been this period during the bubonic plague where, thanks plague, land was a little bit more plentiful. I won't tell you the reason why. I'll let you sort of use your imagination. But land was a little bit more available. But more or less, that had started to decline, that the land availability. To be a noble in Europe was basically to own land, more or less. What does the New World have in large abundance? Well, it has land in large abundance. So lots of these conquistadors are not well-born nobles. We'll talk about the fact that if you were a well-born noble, you would not let your kids go to the New World, because it was just seen as not worth the risk. The voyage alone could kill you, to say nothing of the countless horrors and problems once you get there. But if you're already sort of at the bottom of the social ladder, or maybe even just sort of in the middle of the social hierarchy, um, the perception is you have a lot less to lose. And there is a push, a drive by some of these lower and middle class individuals to sort of make a name for themselves in the New World. And these are basically who the conquistadors are. These are soldiers of fortune, mercenaries, explorers, who basically launch military expeditions to explore and or conquer large sections of the Western Hemisphere. So, firstly, we get Vasco Nunez de Balboa, who crosses the Isthmus of Panama and is considered the first European, key point, to discover the Pacific Ocean, or to see the Pacific Ocean. More significantly, in 1519 to 1521, we have Ferdinand Magellan, who basically circumnavigates the world, which means he basically circles the world. In the process, he proves that all the world's major oceans and seas are more or less connected. Because he basically makes his way across the Atlantic, goes around South America through the Straits of Magellan. Gee, wonder how they got their name. Through the Pacific, and then once in the Pacific, they make their way through the Indian Ocean, circles the Cape of Good Hope, around southern Africa, and they return back to Europe. Now, I said that Magellan circumnavigates the world. A little bit of a misnomer. There ain't no I in team. Well, just try telling that to Magellan. Now, to be fair, he does put a lot into the team because when he crosses the Pacific Ocean, he eventually makes his way to this little tiny archipelago, otherwise known as the Philippines. By the way, that's sarcasm, not very much that's tiny about the Philippines. Um, and by the way, they were named for King Philip of Spain. Again, you're going to see a lot of attempts in the New World to suck up to the boss. But there was an altercation with the natives, and Magellan himself gets killed. By the way, this is ultimately what starts Spain's interest in colonization attempts in the Philippines, and the Philippines are going to be a major component of Spain's overseas empire until the Spanish-American War in the very late 19th century. So, in other words, lots of ripple effects. But like I said, Magellan pretty much gets killed. I'm going to ballpark and say 2/3 of the way across on the 2/3 of the way through the voyage. And by the way, he is not exactly alone there, because the fact is that of the 200-ish people who set sail on this expedition, only 18 make it back to Europe. And actually, of the 5 ships that set sail from Europe, only one, the Victoria, makes it back. And think about this. The Europeans still think it was worthwhile. It's still a profitable venture, even though the fact that almost nobody makes it back home. And why? Because of the cargo in the Victoria. Spice.
The precious substance in the universe is the spice melange. The spice extends life. The spice expands consciousness.
Okay, maybe not that spice exactly, but pretty close to that spice. So, what follows over more or less the next century is a period of almost unbroken Spanish military successes in the New World. And with those military successes, of course, you get colonization. First off, we've got Vasco de Balboa, who establishes a Spanish colony in Panama in search of gold. Spoiler, they don't really find gold, but you do have a permanent Spanish colony there. 1519. This is super important. We'll come back to this guy. You have Hernan Cortez, who conquers Mexico, even though he was explicitly told not to conquer Mexico by the Spanish authorities. In fact, there was a Spanish fleet that was dispatched to arrest Cortez, but Cortez manages to put together an alliance of Native Americans. And I know we've sort of talked about this before, but that alliance of Native Americans manages to overthrow the Aztec Empire, they were not exactly winning popularity contests because of the whole human sacrifice thing. What's important to note about Cortez is Cortez, again, was a middle-class Spaniard. Actually, he was a lawyer who occupied a pretty middle-of-the-rung bureaucratic position in Spanish Cuba. And basically, Cortez decided that he wanted to leave his cubicle job and, go out and conquer some people, and, well, so he does. And manages to conquer basically the entirety of Mexico in the process, or at least the most strategically important parts of Mexico in the process. So Cortez, because he conquers all of this for the Spanish crown, he basically gets a slap on the wrist. In other words, they just kind of look the other way at the fact that he sort of did this in direct defiance of his superiors. So Cortez kind of becomes almost a model for conquistadors, but also Europeans more broadly. Cortez was a nobody before all of this happens. And Cortez manages to amass a fortune for himself in gold just through organizing a few hundred conquistadors and basically a lot of luck in the process. Uh, in demonstrating that Cortez wasn't a fluke, you have Francisco Pizarro, who attacks an Incan empire that was already sort of in the midst of, internal strife and civil war, and he establishes the Spanish city of Lima. Uh, so Pizarro manages to also capture, again with a few hundred volunteers, the last Incan emperor Atahualpa, who is ransomed for a large quantity of gold. That seems pretty fair. So uh, you get your emperor back, and all it costs you is a whole lot of gold, except Pizarro doesn't give the emperor back. He decides instead to strangle him, which, by the way, tells you a lot about these conquistadors. So, yes, they're able to climb up the ladder. They are some of the first rags to riches stories in the New World, but these were not nice people. Mercenaries in general don't exactly attract Mother Teresa personality types, but even within that continuum, uh, the continuum of mercenaries, the conquistadors were especially cutthroat and brutal. So these early colonies have a few things in common. One is that conquistador heritage, which matters quite a bit, actually. Uh, so remember that the conquistadors are these young-ish people in their 20s, 30s, early 40s. Many of them are single. And again, these are people who don't really matter or rate on the social hierarchy. Most of them are lower to middle class individuals, not incredibly well educated, some of them probably illiterate. And all of a sudden, they now find themselves in control of, like if you're Cortez, most of central Mexico. If you're Francisco Pizarro, large quantities of like modern day Peru. So, in other words, these individuals who know absolutely nothing about administration are called to administer territories the size of entire countries today. So these are fairly loose administrative systems. Again, they're spearheaded by the military. They're not really spearheaded by, bureaucrats or administrators. Eventually, you do get a bit more complexity in the colonies, and this complexity is provided by um, sort of two different layers. The first is the church. So remember, we have God, gold, and glory. God is the first in that chain. So you do get the establishment of tons of Spanish missions in the New World. And the goal is to convert the Native Americans to Roman Catholicism. And we should also mention that in this mission, they are overwhelmingly successful. But also, you have the creation of sort of European style feudalism in the New World with the establishment of agricultural settlements, oftentimes haciendas, which are basically these estates or manors, you could probably just call them plantations, that are established by bureaucrats, and these are coming in from Europe. These transplanted Europeans are going to create another social class in the New World for themselves. We'll talk about the impact of that much later. Now, if you are Emperor Charles V or his eventual successor, Philip II of Spain, you've got a pretty sizable to-do list. So, among other things, you've got all of these colonies in the New World that have to be managed. You also have the fact that Spain is a European superpower, probably the first real European superpower since, well, at the very least, Charlemagne. Um, And you have a lot of potential opponents and competitors you have to deal with. We'll talk about the fact that uh, Spain is basically in control of the Holy Roman Empire for a large portion of this period. And Spain sees itself as the defender of Catholicism, which means that it's trying to stamp out those pesky Protestants, spoiler, that start to emerge in the early 1500s. It also means that they're trying to repel Muslim invaders, excuse me, from the Ottoman Empire. And so you've got all of these things happening that the Spanish are trying to take control of, and it means that um, eventually overseas colonization sort of goes by the wayside. And the Spanish, more generally, were more focused on uh, the New World as a place to extract resources, not as a place for people to go and live. So it's perhaps for some of these reasons why, over the next century or so, the Spanish story of colonization takes the back seat to the Northern European story of colonization. So, Northern European states, and we're going to basically focus on France, England, and the Netherlands, or Holland, um, they have a much smaller to do list than the Spanish or even the Portuguese. So, in other words, it's going to be much easier for them to expand. And we'll also talk about some of the reasons why ultimately Northern European empires are sort of destined for arguably greater success even than the Spanish. Um, Now, by the time the English, the French, and the Spanish start to really consider overseas colonization, colonization of the New World has already been in existence for at least a couple of generations. Something that's kind of interesting to consider is that by the time England launches its first failed overseas colony in Roanoke, North Carolina, um, the European presence in the New World was already almost a century old by that point. So, in other words, you see these colonization attempts occur um, almost 100 years after the Columbian Exchange. So most of these early efforts focus on finding an Arctic-based passage to East Asia called the Northwest Passage. They never quite discover that. Oh well, again, maybe global warming might eventually give them a pass there. Um, but in the process of, trying to discover these water-based routes to East Asia, you see the establishment of other European colonies. So the Dutch, they focus colonies on Southeast Asian islands, Sri Lanka, South Africa, and by Southeast Asian islands, we mean Indonesia, where you have lots and lots of spices. They also established a colony in this obscure overseas possession that's not very ideal for any kind of city or urban development whatsoever, called Manhattan. It doesn't stay Dutch, but they are the first to establish a colony there. And then we have the French. They set up colonies in Midwestern and Southern United States via the Mississippi area, Canada. Basically, what that's referring to, I think, is Louisiana. But most of France's early efforts are going to be focused on Canada along the St. Lawrence River. So one thing now we're going to sort of focus specifically on the British and the Dutch. In other words, we're going to focus on the British and the Netherlands for just a second, because they establish these immense joint stock companies that are what we call public-private partnerships. So, in other words, they are ultimately regulated by the state. The state charters these corporations, but it also allows for private investment. Um, So the Dutch and British East India companies, um, these companies become so powerful that, I mean, eventually the British East India Company ends up running most of India. The Dutch um, East India Company, excuse me, eventually runs most of Indonesia. So these are, in other words, you're not. Don't think of them as like Microsoft or Amazon or Apple. Think of them as uh, separate countries, more or less, with European administration. So, why Northern Europe? Why does Northern Europe eventually, not immediately, but eventually skip ahead? So, why Northern Europe? Well, one reason why Northern Europe is able to sort of leapfrog ahead of the Spanish and the Portuguese eventually is because these colonies were often established by private investors for the interest of making profit. And this doesn't necessarily require the discovery of gold. Again, a lot of these colonies were established at first because they were trying to find the Northwest Passage. But you get colonies that are established for reasons as varied as to create cash crop plantations, or in the case of Roanoke, basically to be a safe haven for pirates and privateers who were preying on Spanish shipping. Um, so these are mostly private led ventures. In other words, these are people who are interested in making money. And that does include the state because the state helps create these joint stock companies that colonize lots of the New World. But it also includes just ordinary people. And lots of these colonies are being established uh, as places for people to live. The other thing is that in the case of both England and the Netherlands, you do have representative governments. Why does that matter? Um, well, one of the things that most representative governments demand is they tend to demand, most people tend to demand, that the state not just be able to take their stuff. Um, and remember, during the Middle Ages, and even now, during this age of what we call royal absolutism, where the monarch was seen as all powerful, the fact that you had governments that would guarantee, at least at some level, people's personal property rights meant that people felt more confident in investing in maybe risky ventures like overseas colonization. The other thing is that the states involved tended to be smaller and decentralized. England during this time period is very decentralized compared to the Spanish. Remember, the Spanish basically have no real limitation on the extent to which they can tax their people. Whereas in England, you have Magna Carta, you have a parliament that has to give consent for people to be taxed. So this doesn't seem like it would be a significant advantage because the Spanish being able to, you know, if the Spanish want to, they can raise significant tax rates on their people, and then they can funnel that tax revenue into, hundreds of overseas colonies if they really want to. And that is indeed what they do at first. But it also means that one, people get taxed to such an extent in Spain that you don't really have that middle class, that strong middle class like you see in England, the Netherlands, and France that are willing to invest in overseas colonization. Um, the other thing is that if your government is smaller, it's less likely to oppress you, and its ability to take your stuff is a lot more limited. These are a series of reasons. Again, there's no one reason that's uniquely explains why Northern Europe is able to leapfrog ahead, but eventually it does. And a thesis that I'm going to make is that um, England, especially, creates probably the most successful of all the overseas colonies. Not by intention, almost by accident, uh, but the things that make England's colonies work are also the things that destined their colonies to eventually break away in 1776. We'll come back to that point a little bit later, actually. So by 1550, Europe is kind of coming into its own. If we look, Spain has acquired more territory than was occupied by the Roman Empire at its height. And by the way, the Spanish are going to still expand and colonize a whole lot more. And this doesn't even begin to take into account some of the northern European colonies that we've already discussed. Colonies along the eastern seaboard of the United States, Canada, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, etc. So it already seems like the world is becoming a much more European one. And remember, that was inherently a bizarre development because Europe wasn't historically all that well developed until this time period. So this is where the Europeans are. Next time we'll talk about what it is they're doing there.